This gathering, however, is somewhat unusual for our Understanding Boston series, in that it focuses on the response to a crisis that took place not in our community or even in our region, which is what we're normally talking about here, but thousands of miles away in Southeast Asia. As you know, on December 26th of last year, we all heard the news of a giant tidal wave, a tsunami, striking the shores of several countries in South and Southeast Asia. With each passing hour, the news of the death and the devastation that the tsunami left in its wake was more horrifying. The scale of the damage to people and property was so vast that it was almost impossible to grasp. I think for many of us, the only way we could cope with the news was to do something. And for most of us, that meant making donations to relief efforts. As one Jesuit relief worker put it, the need is great, and so is the opportunity to help. The American response was extremely generous, prompting the greatest outpouring of charitable donations in response to a disaster since the tragedy of September 11th. Beginning in January of 2005, the Center on Philanthropy at Indiana University began tracking charitable support from the United States for direct relief to Southeast Asia. The tally includes the amount reported in private cash donations and in-kind gifts. I checked the center's website yesterday, and the total as of April 28th was more than $1.4 billion. In addition to dollar donations, of course, many Americans gave of their time and their expertise. A team of physicians, as you know, from our own Massachusetts General Hospital volunteered aboard Project Hope's USNS Mercy. Boston Foundation donors also gave generously. In addition to the Foundation's discretionary funds, which are earmarked for programs here in Greater Boston, the Foundation also has hundreds of donor-advised funds that are set up by people, many of whom are in this room, who want to be actively involved in the grant-making process. Gifts from these kinds of funds can benefit programs anywhere in the United States and anywhere throughout the world, and they represent more than half of all the dollars distributed by the Foundation every year. To date, through these funds, Boston Foundation donors have made gifts totaling more than $225,000 to tsunami relief efforts. Although that's an impressive figure, it represents a small percentage of the total gifts that will be made out of our donor-advised funds this year, which will probably be close to $30 million. What does the high level of giving on the part of American individuals and foundations to a disaster that took place so far away mean to philanthropy, here in Boston and in the United States generally? One of the most prominent findings of the Boston Foundation's latest Boston Indicators report, released at the end of March, was that we are living in a global era, and we should see everything we do in this city and region in a global context. Does that apply to philanthropy also? We'll be considering these questions and more this morning. First, I'd like to introduce someone who can help us better understand what it was like on the ground right after the tsunami. I'd like to introduce Regina Swatska, who is the Director of International Services for the American Red Cross of Massachusetts Bay. She's going to give us a visual sense of what was going on in Southeast Asia right after the tsunami and talk briefly. Come on up, Regina.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for this special invitation. As I departed in January 2005 for Sri Lanka to support American Red Cross Emergency Response Unit, I was reminded of my experience the previous year going to help out after the earthquake in Bam, Iran, and seeing the sign posted by survivors around their beautiful but now devastated ancient city. Bam is still alive. This sign was their hope for the future. I left for Sri Lanka with an understanding that international relief presence in South Asia would ease the pain of the tsunami survivors, help to rebuild their life, and be their sign of hope. Everything about the December 26 Indian Ocean tsunami defines imagination. the scale of devastation, the loss of life, the global response, the life-saving gestures of local people, resilience of survivors. The tsunami hit the rich and the poor, the Tamils, the Sinhalese, and the Muslim. Ethnic and class differences vanished during the rescue work. Most of the people who have lost everything were living right now in the camps, in the shelters, in the host families. Many survivors prefer to stay close to the ruin of their houses and live in small huts, tents, spending time cleaning the area. Immediate needs include food and non-food relief items, shelter, clean water, sanitation, healthcare, and tracing services. Some 280,000 people died or are still missing, where millions left homeless. This statistic failed to convey the scope of individual losses. Many children were killed because they couldn't outrun the waves or were more vulnerable to the deadly waterborne debris. Other children survived, but only as orphans. Many of them were unable to talk about what happened. The needs for assistance to help children work through their shock was big. At schools, during the distribution, I have seen pictures painted by them. Pictures recounted memories of the ruins and debris left by tsunami, a dark-colored ocean with headless corpses in it, family members accompanied by the quotation, "I lost." The children I've met were beautiful and smiling. It's hard to believe that behind each smile you see right now lies the story which breaks our heart. About 1.5 million children were affected by the tsunami across Asia and Africa. 1/3 of the recorded deaths were children. Women and men struggle to go through the day. Without money, employment, and basic household equipment, it was really hard to take care of the family. Even within the Red Cross movement, we mourn the losses of colleagues. Just in one town, more than 20 staff died, including the branch secretary general. Others lost their family members, some up to 25 people. But despite their personal tragedies, Red Cross volunteers and staff in affected regions came together to help these most in need. They organized evacuations and essential care for the wounded. There were no offices, cars, computers or phones. They had hardly any equipment beyond their Red Cross vests, which served at least to bolster the vital team spirit that helped function in the midst of devastation and death. Many of volunteers have never set foot in some of this area before because of armed conflict in this territory, and only few of them had ever seen a dead body. But in one day, some teams recovered more than 100. As one of them recounted, "It was beyond anything you can imagine. The first days were very difficult, and at night I dreamt I was still collecting bodies." In the immediate aftermath of the tsunami, before help could arrive from the rest of the country and abroad, these young Red Cross volunteers were virtually alone in providing relief. And later, they became an essential part of our international relief team. Across the tsunami zone, in the largest emergency operation in the history of the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent coordinated the movement response in Thailand, the Maldives, southern and western part of Sri Lanka, Indonesia except Aceh, and Eastern Africa. The International Committee of Red Cross took responsibility for northern and eastern Sri Lanka and Aceh conflict zone areas. The American Red Cross was there, getting life-saving aid into the hands of tsunami survivors by distributing emergency food, safe drinking water, tents, tarps for shelters, mosquito nets for protection from diseases, kitchen sets, family hygiene kits, clothing, and more. An American Red Cross disaster relief expert have been sent to Sri Lanka, Indonesia, Maldives to assist with psychological training, disease prevention, water and sanitation rehabilitation, food distribution, relief coordination and distribution, tracing, and disaster impact assessment. In all, 40 national Red Cross and Red Crescent societies mobilize over 22,000 international staff, deliver essential services to deliver essential services to survivors. International Federation sent 18 emergency response units, 3 of them from American Red Cross, and nearly 276 flights into Asia in coordination with ICRC, International Committee of Red Cross, and United Nations. Since the beginning of the operation, up to date, over 800 people affected by the disaster have received assistance coordinated by the Red Cross. Over 32 people in Indonesia and Sri Lanka have been able to restore family links and learn whether their family members are still alive with assistance from the International Committee of Red Cross. The Red Cross movement mobilized more than $1.6 billion, and the movement will be making every effort to spend funds in a responsible and transparent way. We are honored and inspired that so many have confidence in the Red Cross to turn their care and compassion into action. Despite the revenues and international goodwill, one still does not have to look very hard to see the enduring emotional scars and physical hardship facing the millions of people affected by this disaster. Living wounded and beautiful Sri Lanka, I thought about the slogan used by the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement in the last years, the power of humanity. And I truly believe that the tsunami gave us a glimpse of this power of humanity. Thank you.
Regina, thank you. And thank you for everything you've done overseas for our Red Cross and for the people you serve there. We'll hear a little bit later from Deborah Jackson, who's the CEO of the American Red Cross of Mass Bay, who's also on our panel. But first I want to introduce the moderator of our panel this morning, Dr. Gloria White-Hammond, my friend and an inspiration to all of us who care about what is happening in Africa and overseas. In addition to serving as a minister at Bethel AME Church with her husband, the Reverend Ray Hammond, and a pediatrician at Boston South End Community Health Center, Gloria has also worked as a medical missionary in several African countries. In 2002, she co-founded the group My Sister's Keeper here in Boston. It's a human rights group organized to support women of southern Sudan in their efforts toward the reconciliation and reconstruction of their communities. That work has led to an even more prominent role for Gloria as a spokesperson for more active involvement by the UN and the United States in the tragedy of what is happening in the Sudan. I'm thrilled to introduce today my friend, Gloria White-Hammond.
Good morning. It is indeed a privilege for me to be with you all this morning. Today's forum, as Mary Jo said, is different from the typical Boston TBF forums because it will take us beyond the city of Boston, even to the uttermost parts of the planet. You've heard Regina talk about her experience in Asia. You're going to hear Paul talk about his experience in Haiti and in the Caribbean. And right now I'm going to invite you to take another trip with me to a place that was very different from the place where you are today. In February of this year, I traveled to Africa, to Sudan, to the western part of Sudan called Darfur. I sat cross-legged in a place very different from the one that we're in today. There were no bricks and no mortar. We sat on the dirt floor of a thatched hut. I sat with a young woman named Karima, whose beauty was enhanced by the amethyst hijab that she wore, delicately framing her face. Karima had been 2 weeks postpartum when her village was attacked. A typical scenario is you're sleeping in your bed at night and The planes flying low over the hut begin to rattle the hut when suddenly bombs are dropped. Karima said that as she could hear the cries and the screams from outside, men in uniforms burst into her hut. Again, at 2 weeks postpartum, she was then raped by 3 gentlemen of sorts. She then loosened her robe to show me the scars that she had on her body after having been brutalized. As a physician, I have seen scarring, and yet I winced as I saw the extent of hers. Ana Asif, I said, I'm sorry. And then we embraced and wept together, woman to woman, rocking to the rhythm of her lamentations. I went to Darfur just after the tsunami. I went to show up in the lives of women in Sudan to reassure them that American women had neither turned a deaf ear nor a blind eye to their plight. We met with over 60 displaced women in similar surroundings as that in which I met Karima. Of the 60 women with whom we spoke, 40% reported having been raped. These are authentic models of grace under fire. Certainly Karima's story is by no means unique. It is a familiar story throughout Darfur, and in fact a familiar story throughout all of Sudan. As Mary Jo said to you, I have also been involved in the war in southern Sudan. That war is some 20 years old. That war pits the government of Sudan against people who are primarily practitioners of traditional religions and Christians. For the last 4 years now, I've made 6 trips into southern Sudan, and I have since partnered with a women's association in one of the counties there. Because of the generosity of people of Boston, primarily women of Boston, we've been able to provide 2 economic development projects for the women, 2 grinding mill projects. We've also started a girls' school, so you all have a school in Boston, in Sudan, called My Sister's Keeper School for Girls. The challenge which I face is not unlike the challenges of the groups that you will hear from today. And that is how to move the people of the richest country in the world to support the poorest people in the world. How to paint a picture in such a way that it really matters. How to help people see that helping others is not simply the righteous thing to do, but it is in fact the right thing to do. And so part of our challenge has been to shape this message in such a way that it is indeed a universal message. One of the themes that we have shared as we've gone around the country now, and actually you can pray for me. On Thursday I'm scheduled to go with a delegation of women with whom I went to Sudan to meet with Condoleezza Rice's staff to encourage her, indeed to compel her, to do much more on behalf of the women in Sudan. And our message is that, particularly in Sudan, but in a number of conflicts around the world, that women are indeed the primary victims of the war. To take out a woman is to take out her children and her children's children. It is indeed a strategic weapon of mass psychosocial spiritual destruction designed to undermine the well-being of communities for generations yet unborn. We will say to her that she needs to do more about the situation in Darfur, because it's not simply about the people of Darfur, it's not simply about the women of Darfur, but it's about women everywhere who on a daily basis suffer sexual violence. So it's not only about Darfur, it's about Mexico, it's about England, it's about America. It's about a culture that allows violence against women to operate worldwide with impunity. And quite simply, in sharing that message, it's not only true, but it's also designed to, quite frankly, to strategically allow people to identify with someone other than themselves. I think one of the important lessons that we've learned from the tsunami, and we were actually scheduled to go right after the tsunami. There was a glitch in the scheduling, and so we went a month later. When we heard about the tsunami, we quite frankly panicked because we wondered whether or not Americans would have enough will and enough dollars to make a contribution to some other people. And so it is a conversation that we'll have today. I think what the tsunami did demonstrate was that, in fact, the giving well had not gone dry. But again, it's really a matter of trying to figure out how to tap into the hearts and the minds of good-minded people to see that their own situation, which perhaps may be challenging for them, is not nearly as challenging as the people whose pictures you saw reflected in Regina's presentation. And so it is indeed my privilege to have today the opportunity to extend to our speakers a bit of time to talk about their mission, about their work, about the challenges of moving people to give of their time and their talent and their treasure. Our first speaker for this morning is Paul Shervish. Paul is the director of the Center on Wealth and Philanthropy at Boston College. He's conducting ongoing research about philanthropy, focusing on such topics as the motivations for charitable giving, the demographic patterns of wealth and charitable giving, and, I like this especially, on the spirituality of financial life. He will provide the overall context for the discussion, including data on the recent outpouring of relief for the tsunami victims and how it stacks up with charitable giving at home. Please receive Paul.
Thank you, Gloria. May I just shut this computer and put my notes on top of it? Why don't I just go over here? You see all of this? I'm not going to do that. I'll put this on top. There's just a few pages. Good morning. I'm reminded about a quote from Gustavo Gutierrez, who is the Peruvian liberation theologian, who once said that when being honored for his theology, that all of my theological writings are not equal to one simple act of liberating care. And so I am not in the middle of all the activities of liberating care that my colleagues are involved in. But let me try to put it into a context. And the context is one that I hope encourages rather than discourages hearts. My colleague John Havens and I have worked from the beginning in our research, in part dispelling myths about the lack of generosity of this group or that group. And one of the myths that we really have to understand, because it is partly my own fault, is the analysis that comes out of Giving USA, because John and I are both members of the Methodology Advisory Committee of that. And when you see that the United States contributes internationally only 4% of its charitable giving, that is completely misleading, because every one of the Red Crosses are not listed in that international giving. Catholic Charities is not listed in that giving. Lutheran Social Services is not listed in that giving. And virtually every dollar of the $2 billion that has been contributed for tsunami relief from corporations, from the U.S. government, and from private foundations and citizens will not be listed as international giving. And it just is a function of the way those statistics are kept. So once again, I want to suggest that what you read in the statistics and hear people report are not evincing this hill that we must push the rock up as Sisyphus did. but as Gloria pointed out, represents already a momentum and a sense of care that we want to work with rather than against. I did mention the close to $2 billion. It's $2 billion and counting. I did a lot of work to come up with the numbers that were already cited, and I did look at the centers on Philanthropy's website. Think of about 350 million to 450 million from the U.S. government and counting. That doesn't count about $5 million a day in the use of U.S. military equipment and airplanes and helicopters and personnel. Think of between 325 and a pledge from just the other day of $580 million from U.S. corporations in dollars and in-kind assistance. And think of between $1 billion and $1.2 billion of aid from individuals and foundations in the United States. Now, what I want to do in just a couple more minutes is to indicate a framework within which to understand the kinds of stories that we've already heard and what we will hear more of in a few minutes. I want you to think of two terms, if you will, capacity or resources on the one hand, and philia, P-H-I-L-I-A, on the other hand. Philia is the noun, phileo the verb, from which philanthropy is derived. And we often think of philia as love, and it isn't really in the Greek. It's a special kind of affection. It's a friendship love. It's a friendship affection, and Aristotle talks about how this is the first relationship between mother and child, between father and child. It's a relationship of philia, not one in which there's an absence of a self, but a mutuality of self. That is, as Aristotle puts it, two bodies and one soul. And so what I want to suggest is that what we see with international aid